Catch up on all the live shows right here on africatechradio.com.
Yes, welcome to another episode of 20s Tech Side on Africa Tech Radio. Early in 2023, I asked if Africa was ready for a 4-day work week. I spoke to an entrepreneur / employer. I also spoke to an employee, an HR person, and I spoke to Karen Lowe. Yes. And Karen at that time was pushing or leading the 4-day work week or the 4-day week South Africa pilot. And after the conversation, towards the end, I asked if Karen would be fine with us looking at the results from the pilot and the feedback from the pilot. And she was like, oh, yes, sure, why not? I'm happy to, return with the results. And I'm like, okay, I would not forget that. So I'm recording this in December 2023. And guess what? The results are out. For school children, when you hear the results are out, well, mixed feelings. And I have Karen on this episode, but I do not just have Karen alone. I also have Mark on this episode. Karen is the director of the 4-Day Week South Africa NPC and chairperson of the 4-Day Week South African Coalition. And hi, Karen. How are you doing today?
Hi, Anthony. So nice to be chatting to you again. Thank you for having me.
And I have someone else who I would like Karen to introduce. He's also on the call. He'd be helping us better understand specifics of the results because he was a key partner in the research that was carried out in South Africa for the pilot. So, Karen?
Absolutely, Anthony. I'd like to introduce everyone to Professor Mark Smith. At the time of the start of the 4-day week trial, Mark and his team at Stellenbosch Business School led out on the qualitative research findings around the first pioneer pilot in South Africa. So Professor Smith really interviewed all of the 28 pilot companies that took part, including one Botswanan company, both at the start of the trial and at the end of the trial. So has an enormous amount of knowledge and interest, not just in the broader global conversation, but worked very closely with 4-day week South Africa in his capacity and partner, Stellenbosch Business School. Mark, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. A great pleasure to be here, and thanks, Anthony, for the invitation.
Great to have you speaking with me. I'm really happy. Karen, how does it feel? The results are out. First, just describe how you feel.
Anthony, when because I never got to see the reports, I had no hand in putting it together. Mm-hmm. I didn't obviously do the research myself, so I must admit it was with a good amount of eager anticipation, a bit of anxiety, and I wasn't too sure what we were going to find. I had an idea that it was going well, but when the results came out, I think there was an immediate sense of elation that it had been so positive and that we had not done dissimilarly to other global pilots in developed countries. I suppose there was a bit of relief work. I wanted us, as South Africa and, representative of the first developing country on the continent, I really wanted this to be an important baseline for us to continue discussions around reduced hours working and, its potential impact to improve well-being in the workplace and all of the rest of it. So as we almost close the year out, I am incredibly proud of the pilot participants. I am very excited about the results, and I'm very optimistic about where this will lead us in the new year.
For this being the first on the continent, the first time this has been tried on the continent. And for those who do not know, this 4-day work week pilot in South Africa started on the 1st of March, 2023. And we have the results. Karen, walk us through the notable outcomes or results from this pilot.
Absolutely, Anthony. So if I may, I'd just like to remind your listeners that the 4-day week campaign and all of the global pilots, including South Africa, did a 6-month trial, and they looked to implement a 20% reduction in the average work week. So everything around the 4-day week is around the 180-100 model. So no change to employee pay or leave, 80% of an average work week in return for 100% productivity. And it's perhaps important to just frame that as context, because the organizations all went out with a mission of adhering to that framework and model. So in the context of it being a productivity experiment at its heart, we start looking at those, harder business measures and impact. So for example, what impact did it have on productivity? What impact did it have on revenue? What impact did it have on absenteeism, resignations, etc.? And we can say that the reported productivity improvement was 49% for this particular pilot. Perhaps really worthy to note that there was no real increase in the intensity of work experienced by the pilot participants. And in fact, 25% of the sample said that their intensity reduced. But we had a revenue positive environment as well. So average revenue growth for that 6 months compared to the previous 6 months of 10.5% reported, absenteeism dropping by 9%, resignations dropping by 11%. But then I suppose the real happier side of the story, once those business boxes are checked, are the improvements in mental health and well-being, and some of the softer markers, as I like to call them. So we saw improvements in mental health of, being reported at 35%, better satisfaction with work-life balance, reported nearly 50%, better time satisfaction, and workability, just an improved, better task management. I'm better able to manage my workload. And then exercise levels improving by 35%. And it doesn't matter what base you're improving from, the fact that there was a reported increase in exercise obviously has a wonderful effect on well-being. Sleep improved by 36%. So if you look at that in the context of a productivity experiment, to summarize, really, we had a revenue positive and productivity positive environment, and we achieved some really, really good improvements in the well-being space, reducing burnout and improving well-being and mental health.
Well-being and productivity, in one sentence. I like that. Professor Mark, as the research lead for this pilot program, what were your thoughts when you started out, before the program started?
My thoughts right at the start, I was like current excitement. I've been working on working time, work-life integration, gender inequality, the way work is organized inside companies for a long time. Often we're researching the increased intensity of work, or precariousness, or flexibilization, where new contracts might mean that people have to work harder or with less security. And this seemed like a kind of positive research project where there's something jointly employees and managers and employers can get involved and work together. And the success that had been seen elsewhere in the world made it sort of seem like an exciting opportunity for South Africa. And then with South Africa being the first developing economy to actually participate, it was a source of pride for us as well, which I think, and even though I'm not a South African national, I feel a source of pride in the institutions and the country and the economy that we could make this work and really test this and see how it would work in South African context.
And if we're talking about the specifics in terms of well-being, what stood out for you?
What stood out for me, I'd say maybe a couple of things. First is that people have a bit more time. So there's quantitative side. They have a little bit more time in the week to do other important things, whether that's looking after their kids or looking after their chickens, or not traveling so far spending so much time traveling to work, or spending time on the beach, or leisure, or sport, or education, whatever it is. And everybody has a different thing that floats their boat, that turns them on. So and everybody gets a bit more time to do that thing. So they have a bit more sort of time in terms of quantity, but they also have a bit more time in terms of quality. And I think that's important for well-being as well. So they have quality time at work. People were keen to come back to work, and managers and employees noted that in the companies that were successful, it's important to say, that they were keen to come back to work and were rested and engaged. So they were doing their best when they were at work. But they also felt, they reported feeling they had time for themselves or time for their families, which is actually more of a qualitative sense in that they don't feel like they're cutting, or they're less that they're cutting back on important time with family members, for example, or with in other things that they need to do for their community. In South Africa, the things that stood out to me were things like people were saying, well, they got time to spend time with their grandmother that they don't see so often, and that they really wanted to spend quality time to do some work with their church and their community, and as well as the maybe things that we might have seen in other countries in terms of more time looking after children, making time to go and watch the cricket match at school or whatever it might be, and all of those things that we might not be able to do if we're constrained by the 5 times 8 sort of 40-hour week.
So in terms of productivity, almost half of the employees reported an increase in productivity during the trial period. Can we compare this, to maybe data before now? And how would you rate the number and the results gotten during the trial period?
Maybe I'll start and Karen can continue. I think at just a very simple level, the fact that companies are doing at least as much as they were doing before, but often more, with people working fewer hours, there's necessarily an increase in productivity. So they haven't magicked more time. They're actually producing or making or delivering or serving the same or more with people working fewer hours. So that's an exciting sort of result, and I think those demonstrates a sort of a rise in productivity. What we did find, and what we find all over the world, is that it's quite hard to measure productivity for white collar jobs. It's quite hard to sort of count the number of maybe creative actions or production of knowledge in the same way as you might count if you were making cars or you were making meals. So those data are a little bit harder to put a finger on. So what we saw was that companies were encouraged to put in place new ways of monitoring productivity as well. So they didn't necessarily have the data before, but they were doing the 4-day week trial encouraged them to think about their productivity more. So they actually thought more clearly about their management processes. And one of the Karen mentioned the article we've just published about the 10 secrets of the 4-day week. And one of the secrets is actually that managers actually reflect more consciously on what they do and what they need to do their job. So we found they were doing more dashboarding, collecting data, so they knew and were able to check if they were keeping up with existing productivity levels. But they might not have had that data before because they just assumed, well, they were doing the right thing, or they didn't actually. They hadn't had the impetus to think about this productivity dimensions. I don't know if Karen might want to add some more from the quantitative side. Sorry.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, productivity is very specific to each organization in terms of what their outputs and outcomes are, and obviously significantly different sometimes across departments and teams. But I think, Mark alluded to this, is where are the inefficiencies that preceded the trial? So a lot of the organizations, or all of the organizations, went through an onboarding process with us where we really got them to focus on where time was being wasted, for example. And it was very much a bottom-up approach. So the staff were consulted in preparation for the trial. So really unlocking conversations around what is productivity to this organization, what is productivity to that individual, and then looking to where time is wasted, where inefficiencies are, meeting culture and meeting management. Are you attaching an agenda? Are you, having a 1-hour meeting instead of a meeting that could be 20 minutes? Are you inviting the right people? Just those kinds of discussions. Is your technology stack optimized What are you using for communications? Are those tools efficient, or are the processes and systems that you had at the start of the trial not facilitating optimal productivity and outputs? So I think just that paradigm shift where you look inwards as an organization and you say, how can we waste less time and improve efficiencies? You find that as the trial progresses, there is a sort of a more mature approach to being able to understand what those outcomes could be and how to optimize them. Mark, I don't know if you've got anything else to add, but digital distractions and meeting culture and poor systems and processes definitely. We always say you've pretty much got 2 to 3 hours every day that you can possibly unlock just by improving systems and processes. And when you're focused on output, and not just the time, it's an overall improvement in culture, in the way the teams interact and communicate with one another. And I mean, just a personal observation from my side, where was the time being wasted? Mm-hmm. Ironically, it wasn't the staff that was wasting time. My clients were time chewers, and we had to sort of address how our client briefing processes went and the number of reverts on a document or a press release or whatever it is. And so there were different efficiencies for me in the communications sector versus somebody that was in an IT software environment. Mm-hmm. But I think productivity is all about efficiency and layering on the intensity. So the last thing we want within the 4-day week is a compressed hours environment where you're trying to work a full 5-day week in 4 days, 4.5 days. That's not what we're after. We're not seeking to increase intensity. So you're just looking at overall. When I say productivity positive, there is this, a sense and a reported shift, and I feel more productive, and my workability has improved. So that would be my contribution.
I was just going to add that I think any of the listeners here today would recognize meetings that they don't need to be in, or meetings that go on for 2 hours when it probably could have been done in 40 minutes, or in that second hour people are flagging or doing their emails or disappearing in terms of engagement. So it's like Karen said, it's not about sort of increasing the intensity of work so that people are burnt out, but just in a shorter time. It's about working. Probably the easiest way to say it is working smarter and better, but doing that collectively. Where say, okay, do people need to be in this meeting? Does the meeting need to be so long? Can we get this done more quickly? Simple things like a standing meeting make people just get to the point quickly. And then go on and do their work. But because people want to protect the 4 days, so everybody has some skin in the game. Everybody says, okay, let's get this done quickly and get the points across and get back to actually doing the work.
It's really important what you just said, because most times when you look at what you think is what makes up for time wasting or what. It's usually just ensuring that the process and the system is a little bit more efficient than it used to be, and you just free up time and use that time to be much more intentional about doing the actual work or getting something done. Now, let's look at the data points that were gathered, the kind of information you looked out for, and maybe not the details, but just the major data points that were gathered while this research was on. Do
you want me to maybe I'll start again and then Karen can
sure.
add in after me. So we interviewed the people who participated in the project at 3 points in time, at the start, the middle, at the end.
Okay.
And we focused at the start on managers, and then we started talking to managers and employees as we progressed. And what we did, we were able to because this is a global study, and South Africa is part of that global study. We're able to benefit from what the researchers have done in other countries, and we'd already been working a little bit with the researchers in Cambridge in the United Kingdom and in Boston in the United States about the study. So we used some of their protocols and some of the type of questions they were asking and the way it was structured to start off. And that gave us a way to make sure we fitted with the protocol of the overall study. And then as we progressed, we added some more specific things for the South African and the African context. So a lot of the 4-day week is rather similar across countries, and that's reassuring. It works in different contexts, and so the research questions and protocols we could apply. But then, for example, in South Africa, we in the second and third phases we started talking a bit more about the impacts of things that they might find in South Africa in terms of transport challenges or challenges for energy and water or crime, etc. And we also then what also emerged for us, we sort of picked up some of the themes from the previous phases as well. So then that's why what Karen was saying about that reflection of managers was something that we pulled out strongly as we progressed through the study. So three points in time, and we used these sort of the international protocols, but then we augmented those to make sure we also captured the local context.
And what creative ways did you notice that people were in their own organizations trying to implement this, like in their own organizations? Maybe any creative ways, innovative ways we were getting around it? When Karen was talking, she said, "Oh, this isn't." I know she mentioned it the last time when we were on a call, sometime in March or April, that this isn't a Monday off or a Friday off exactly. That's it. If you don't want it to be a Monday or Friday off, we can think internally about what we would want to do. So, what examples of creative or innovative ways do you think like these companies worked around ensuring that they had the 80-20-100 or the 20-80-100?
So the ways that companies achieve this is there's actually I think it's around a quarter of companies close on a Friday. So that I'm sure when you were talking about this at the start of the year, people assume it's going to be Fridays off and everything shuts down. And in fact, one of the things we published on my Substack was that it's not about Fridays on the beach. It is about Fridays on the beach. It is about Fridays on the beach for some people, but not everybody at the same time.
Okay.
So most of the organizations have to keep working 5 days, 6 days, even 7 days, depending on what they do in terms of their service. So, and as I said, only a minority of companies do the 4 day. The other companies are doing things like, for example, some people are off on Monday, some people are off on Friday, and then Monday through Thursday, everybody's present. Others have something more like a rotating day off. So, for example, Anthony, you're on Mondays this week, I'm on Tuesdays, Karen's on Wednesdays, and somebody else on Thursdays and Fridays. And then next week you move to Tuesdays, and then over a 5-week period you go through this complete cycle, and every 5th week you get a super long organization. So sometimes you might have somebody who has a very specific thing they need to do on one particular day of the week, so the manager said, well, this person always takes Tuesdays or Wednesdays, whichever day it was, whereas other people might be rotating. Some people work 5 short days. One company, people were working starting on Monday lunchtime and finishing on Friday lunchtime, because then they had a certain continuity, but they realized Friday afternoons were pretty quiet and Monday mornings could be sort of pushed into Monday afternoons. So that worked for them. So the important thing is, it's not an off-the-shelf solution from Karen or from 4 Day South Africa or 4 Day Global. It's up to organizations to find the solution themselves. And that it comes back to your question. It actually inspires a certain amount of creativity, but also a collective effort to find a solution that works for your particular sector and your particular organization.
Karen, do you want to chime in before we continue? Do you want to make any comments?
Yes, just very briefly, because it was an interesting statistic. So the global average across all of the other pilots was 47% of organizations would take the day off as a Friday. And then the South African pilot, only 22.7 of the sample took it as a Friday. And then a further 18% as a Monday or a Friday. But 54% of the sample had no designated day, as Mark was explaining. And I think what's important to note is certainly we observed that South African organizations were a lot more flexible in the approach that they took to deciding which day worked best for them, for the team, and obviously for the outputs and the productivity. And I think it's also important to note, this is a different discussion, but the South African companies were not as close to that full 20% reduction in the work week as some of our global counterparts. So I anticipate that it might take a little bit longer for South African organizations to get closer to that 20% mark. So if you look at organizations that have been trialing this for in excess of 12 months, they're still not often at the full 20%, but they're quite close to that 20% reduction in the work week. Whereas South African companies need to do a little bit more work in getting to that consistent 20% reduction in the work week. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. And what are the unique challenges did this trial pilot face as we wind down with this phase and prepare for probably another one?
I think South Africa, Mark, you can speak more from a qualitative perspective because you interviewed everybody. But Mark, have you got anything to say specifically on that question? You're actually probably in a better position to answer it than I am.
In terms of the transition between the two, so if I understand the question correctly, I think there will be companies mature in terms of their application of 4-day week and or any type of flexible working, and in fact any kind of change. I'm sure again the listeners out there will, as well as being aware of meetings where they don't need to be in, they're also aware that changes are put in place and they take a little bit of time to bed in, and people go through iterations and learn from that. And I think that's one of the things that allows organizations to be a bit more agile, so they keep saying, well, nothing is fixed, we keep sort of changing and growing. I think in relation to those organizations that the overall result that South Africa didn't reduce hours so much, I think we'll see hours being coming down a bit further as more people are involved in that. And I think some of our managers were a bit more reluctant to do the 4-day week themselves. So I think they need to, they'll build a bit more trust and being more comfortable with seeing how that's working. They may come down themselves. But also I think some companies might even talked about joining the trial for a second time, so they can have that sort of support of Karen's organisation to keep going in practicing that sort of reduced working time.
Mark, that's a very important point. Sorry to interrupt, Anthony. The challenges are definitely there. This is not something, there is, as Mark pointed out, there's no roadmap. We're not going to give you the silver bullet and say, here you go, implement this, and this is how you do it. So that is the first and initial challenge for organizations that are going to do a trial, is they have to plan to trial. It's not something that you switch on, it's something you transition towards, and that's really important. So more time spent in planning, going through the 4-day week global curriculum that's designed to enable a successful trial. Organizations that did less planning and preparation definitely took longer to settle. I can speak from personal experience that the month of April and the first week of May was a complete nightmare, because we had 5 consecutive 4-day weeks with all the public holidays that we had. So that put extra strain on my organization, as well as I know one of the other marketing agencies, in a particularly busy month with communication strategies needing to be delivered. And suddenly I have bank holidays and Easter and all of the rest of it. And, it was right at the start of the trial. So they'd literally had March to sort of get into the swing of it, and April and May were 5 consecutive 4-day weeks anyway for a lot of these organizations. So I think just some interesting challenges, and we find the first 2 months are very iterative, and I think that's also important. Organizations that don't have that experimental cap on really need to work harder at consulting and finding the solutions to problems and challenges by talking to the staff. This is not a top-down mandated approach. This is a new you're redesigning your work week, and in order to do that effectively, you need to consult with employees. And when you encounter challenges, perhaps if you've got a seasonal, tax year end, and there needs to be all hands on deck in a particular cycle, in a particular month or month end or whatever it is, you need to work around that. The organization needs to make sure that there is coverage and the output and customer service is being maintained. And I think that's another point that was very interesting for me, speaking to some of the pilot participants, is a lot of them referred to it as a call day. So it was not a right, it was a privilege. So you earned your intentional rest day through being more productive in the 4 days that you were working. And it's a new contract that's established with your workers. There's an intrinsic motivation that starts developing, but there are staff and employees that would suddenly go, okay, well, sorry, I can't get back to that client because it's my 4-day weekday. And those kind of conversations, we needed to keep reminding staff, this is a reward. It's an incentive to give you more intentional rest and improve intentional productivity. So it has to be that win-win, and we do have to remind staff, not all, but some staff, that you need to earn this. It's a win for an organization, and it's a win for an employee. And if that goes out of balance and entitlement creeps in, then organizations will face challenge and need to remind employees that this is an incentive, and the entire organization's ability to transition successfully to a 4-day week is dependent on everyone doing their bit. So everyone needs to do their heavy lifting and be accountable for their outputs.
Interesting. So where do we go from here? What's next? 2024? What exactly should we expect?
So Anthony, we've got another 6 South African companies, slightly larger in size than our first cohort, that are going into trial early in the new year. In fact, some have already started. And we're open for organizations, small and large, to come on board and start experimenting with the 4-day week. But from a global perspective, and perhaps closer to home here from an African continent perspective, we now have a really good baseline data set for South Africa. So I would like to extend the sample type out into different industry sectors. So Mark and I have often spoken about sector-specific trials. So we would really like to start testing reduced hours working in manufacturing, in mining, in agriculture, in retail banking, in FMCG. There's so many environments where you have a huge variance in your highly skilled worker and your less skilled worker. So how do we do back end and front end? How do we do less skilled, more labor intensive manufacturing type of environments versus your high skill knowledge worker environments? So making it more inclusive and looking at the idea of inclusive flexibility in different industry sectors where we know it's worked internationally, but we would like to see it work in South Africa. Namibia then has just come online, and they will be reaching out to Namibian companies to start a trial next year, a country-specific trial. And then we've been in discussions with Botswana, with Kenya, a potential partner in Nigeria. And because we've just secured a French partner, we will also be looking at some of the French-speaking territories in Africa, because we're now able to take all of our course material and curriculum and have it fully translated into the native language. So we're extending globally into Spanish and French and Italian and so on and so forth. So and then another key point is because of South Africa's efforts, India reached out to us and said, we'd like to do a trial. So India is gearing up for their first trial. So I suppose we're just leading the way as a developing country. We've shown it can work and achieve relatively similar results to developed country trials. It's time to broaden the sector, and it's time to move up into the African continent. And what is so exciting for me is that we're looking at an Africa with a very, very young workforce, whereas Europe and a lot of other countries are experiencing an aging workforce, and the talent wars are very real, Anthony. Organizations globally are poaching our talent, so there's definitely a war on talent. Well-being is at critical levels, certainly in South Africa and other countries. So, what can the 4-day week do to improve organizations' ability to attract and retain talent and improve the overall sort of well-being, reduce levels of burnout and prevalence of mental health in the workplace? And then I would like to see more research done. And Mark and I, again, we've spoken about this a lot, but in diversity and inclusion and in skills development. And so what other sort of social impact studies can we do that are not currently tracked as part of the sort of global mandate that Boston does? So this is where local partnerships with local universities like Stellenbosch Business School and the University of Botswana, for example, would be really critical. So what is pertinent to that territory? What are their stresses that they're facing as a country? So for South Africa, Southern Africa is at greatest risk, number 1 in the world for talent loss, greatest risk. And we have the second worst well-being score. Mental health is a component of well-being in the world. So we're dealing with critical levels, and that's costing business a lot of money. If you've got burnt out workforces or constrained workforces that are not operating at optimal capacity, there's no rest, you've got absenteeism. That's a direct cost to bottom line. Presenteeism, and staff that are not at capacity but they attend work but don't really output anything, also costs money. So if we can start looking at that whole recruitment and retention strategy, how to optimize that through reduced hours working, we are testing the hypothesis: can we attract and retain talent, and to what extent can we do that as an African continent and country specific, and start turning the needle on diversity and inclusion, more women in the workplace, making it more accessible. As a working mum myself, that's critical for me. How can we, look at the sort of the non-work burden of care? Can we create more equality in the home environment where the traditional caregiver as the woman, there's more load being carried by a partner, perhaps. So there's all sorts of things that we'd like to study. So what's next is to approach governments for sector trials, sponsored trials, and perhaps private sector, and to start trialing with organizations that are large. So that's another thing that we're doing now, is consulting to large organizations in certain sectors, specifically actually in insurance and banking, has been quite progressive. And 1 or 2 of our large manufacturers, auto manufacturers, have approached us. And we design a bespoke trial, and we go through a very specific planning process with these organizations. So 2024 is about scale. It's about more research. It's about sector-led research, and just asking more organizations to trial and transition. That's what I would like to see. And I'd like to see a lot more African countries coming on board so that we can stem the critical loss of talent and see if we can be leaders in work time reduction, improving productivity and everything that goes with it, instead of following the lead from developed countries. I think there's some very unique things that we can test and trial in Africa.
Thank you very much. In Nigeria, it's called the hashtag Jackpot syndrome. Yes, loss of talent. Thank you so much. I really hope that we get to the point where the very young workforce we have on the continent would exist in workplaces that place, premium productivity as well as well-being, and not one suffers for the other, so that we're all, better for it. The companies, employers, employees, and the continent as a whole. Thank you very much, Karen Lowe, Director of 40 Week South Africa NPC and Chairperson of the 40 Week SA Coalition. Thank you for, coming back on this platform to share the results and the challenges and what the future holds for the, trying this out. And as you said, it's not like we're handing anybody the blueprint, and just go and do what it says. No. We're all in it together. We're all figuring it out together. And that's all we really need. Thank you very much, Karen Lowe.
Thank you for having me, Anthony. It was a pleasure to talk to you.
Yes. And Professor Mark Smith of the Stellenbosch Business School, the research lead for this project. Thank you very much for coming on and sharing, with us. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you. It's been a great pleasure.
Beautiful. So in case you need to catch up on the previous episode, that which is Africa Ready for the 4-day work week, you can search on the website Africa Tech Radio or wherever you listen to your podcast from, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you listen to your podcast from, and you'd find the conversation I had with Karen and with 3 others, an HR professional, an employer, and an employee, to get a better understanding of how what their thoughts are about the 4-day work week, and how Karen broke down how it's mainly about productivity and well-being being in the same conversation at work.
Thanks for listening, and don't forget to catch up on all the live shows right here on africatechradio.com.